Nintendo Switch,
the Nintendo Entertainment System,
Portable, Game Boy,
all of Nintendo's entertainment DNA,
like no other system.
Virtual Boy.
pack each and every one of these features
360-degree movement.
into the system.
I think at least to some degree, Nintendo's console strategy is always trying to build on what worked for them before. So I figured it'd be fun to detail what contributions all of their platforms could have on the upcoming generation to maybe come away with a better idea on what we should expect with the successor to the Nintendo Switch. And with that, we are starting with Nintendo's least important platform by a light year, Virtual Boy. But first, subscribe, click the like button, the notification bell if you enjoy these videos and want to see more. This is one of the best ways to make creating them on a consistent basis feasible. And next, a quick honorable, maybe sacrilegious for some people, mention for this list, since I didn't have a better place to put it and keep the flow of the video consistent. Despite their importance to Nintendo's console making legacy, NES, Game Boy, and by extension Game Boy Advance didn't contribute a whole lot to the table that can really be iterated on. Like, I initially had them high in terms of what they introduced to the industry, being the creation of the D-pad and the proliferation of handheld gaming as a whole, but these aren't really things that a new platform can learn from. It can only really include these teachings straight up, which matters, but doesn't make the cut for having little to no room to actually grow like everything else here on this list. It's well documented on the internet that the rudimentary VR on the Virtual Boy was headache-inducingly awful.
I could already feel my eyes straining to focus on the red and black displays.
How would you like to play bad games and have a headache too?
But they should get points for trying. I'll even go so far as to say it's yet another thing that Nintendo was ahead of the curve on that nobody really talks about in regards to technology. So far ahead that it still isn't worthwhile to most people. That said, it is a feature I think is worth some level of investment from Nintendo on their next console. Not to the degree that some people have suggested with it being a new glasses-free 3D level gimmick, but rather something more akin to Labo VR on Nintendo Switch. I think it should go a bit further than that, to be clear, but not that much further. In other words, I think Nintendo should make it a dedicated accessory more on the level of, say, a Wii Fit board, rather than something relatively low entry like Labo, or on the other end of the spectrum being something as expensive as PSVR 2. I think VR at present is a cool party trick, and it will only ever be able to evolve past that once it's ubiquitous, and that can only happen if it's accessible and feels essential on some level. To put it plainly, it needs to be Wii Sports. Motion gaming existed far before Wii, but it wasn't until Wii Sports that it clicked for the masses, and that's because Nintendo EAD nailed the balance that I'm talking about here. All of that said, I also understand that VR is not accessible for a lot of people physically. It should be positioned as a bonus pet project, think Ring Fit Adventure from this generation, rather than the main attraction like 3D was advertised for 3DS. Even though that didn't end up actually being the selling point. I think Nintendo Switch's successor doesn't really need a central gimmick to succeed, although I'll get back to this later. Certainly not one that they previously tried and abandoned, and like I mentioned, it's needlessly exclusionary. If VR ends up being a part of the equation, it should be via an increased focus on modularity, potential the OG Switch demonstrated but ultimately failed to follow through on, which brings us to GameCube. The GameCube is where we get into industry-defining features. The C-Stick and analog triggers have both proven to be popular with fans and have forever changed the way we play games. Some people a bit too much, arguably. I'm sure we all know that one guy that swears up and down that the GameCube controller is the best controller that Nintendo has ever created. You may even be one of them, and you might even think it's the best controller that anyone has ever created. I personally disagree for various reasons, but I will say that there's a lot of lessons that Nintendo can learn from it anyway. Nintendo has fallen behind in terms of pushing the limits of their trigger buttons to their competition. Most other modern controllers have some sort of analog triggers, and while I am not a huge fan of their partially squishy, partially clicky application on GameCube, I do think they should return to the well to be more in line with PlayStation in particular in this area. I think Nintendo would be smart to use more modular triggers for their controllers this generation that can accommodate both deep and shallow presses in a way that feels more smooth than it does with GameCube. And while the same can't necessarily be said for the shoulder buttons, since GameCube only had half of those, and even when we look at Switch, those haven't seen much change in the industry at large either, but Nintendo could end up being responsible for pushing that needle forward on their own. There's been rumors that Nintendo will make use of the scrolling trigger button pattern, and I would love to see the possibilities that come with new inputs like this on their modern controllers. I think these two things could be a phenomenal way to continue to define what gamers expect out of their controllers in the same way GameCube did, and for some people continues to. Not only that, but the analog trigger change would improve the experience of playing GameCube games by enabling true analog input for the games that originally leveraged the analog triggers, like Melee's light shielding or Flood and Sunshine. On that note, the Wii U gamepad was so close to being what people wanted, but ultimately developers in and out of Nintendo never truly embraced the technology. Regardless, I think the gamepad had some untapped potential. Dual screen support could open a lot of doors, both in terms of future potential gameplay applications and in the interest of backward compatibility with both the few Wii U games that truly leverage the dual screen and, of course, the duo of Nintendo's handheld dual screen consoles. I still vastly prefer the ability to engage with Splatoon's map by simply looking at it rather than what I consider the more clumsy solution in its sequels on Switch. And the same could be said for Mario Maker. I much prefer the ability to create and edit my maps using the touchscreen rather than fumbling around with the controller inputs. And Pokemon games also benefit from having individual players with their own screens, and that's just to name a few. And don't get me wrong, I don't think every game needs or even would work well with dual screen, which is why it's yet another thing I feel would be better off as a relatively inexpensive add-on akin to what I talked about with the VR solution. My only concern with this is that developers may never utilize it for fear of the user base being too fragmented, but at the same time, assuming they can get the price low enough for what I ultimately believe could just be a relatively cheap touchscreen that can connect via USB-C or potentially wirelessly, it'd be no different from Nintendo releasing the NSO Classic controllers for all of the platforms that they support in the Nintendo Switch Online library of titles. And that could be the consistent foundation for building a user base that could justify utilizing the tech in future titles for developers. Also, and this is a bit of a footnote, but it's not like every console feature usually sees most developers embrace them. And this is true for every console manufacturer. Like, obviously, easy examples would be the IR sensor on Nintendo Switch, but also equally worth noting how many studios really embrace adaptive triggers or haptic feedback on PS5 in the grand scheme of things. Not a whole lot. Even still, I think these features are always worth investing in because they keep gaming interesting, much in the same way the Wii U gamepad did in its day. In my opinion, at least. Like I already mentioned a few times, 3DS's glasses-free 3D was neat and executed well, but it proved to be largely inessential to consumers to the point where Nintendo phased it out entirely on later models, but something that persisted and lived on past 3DS in the hearts of fans is StreetPass.
StreetPass lets Nintendo 3DS exchange data automatically with other Nintendo 3DS systems within range.
I'm not even going to try to go into the impact this feature had. I implore you all to head on over to Nintendo Life to check out Xeon's documentary on StreetPass. I'll link it in the card above and in the description, and then you can come back so you can fully appreciate why I think it's important to bring the feature back on Nintendo Switch's successor. And not just that, but to expand on it to be more complementary to the way people live life today that's at least moderately different from the way we did when 3DS was the current console. One way I think it's different that I think could expand StreetPass is the wide widening of Nintendo's business. They don't just have this one ancillary handheld device. They now also support mobile phones and have a presence in international theme parks. Two things I think could be utilized pretty naturally to improve StreetPass. I think there's definitely something to be said about encouraging people to bring their physical consoles with them to interact with other people that also have the same console, but it's worth acknowledging that this isn't always feasible for a variety of reasons for most people. So I think adding mobile phones and even the Super Nintendo World wristbands into the fold could make StreetPass feel that much more central to the platform as a whole, and if they want, each level of interaction could bring with them different experiences to further encourage people to do the full shebang of bringing the console with you. In addition to that, I think this also brings with it a lot of potential dedicated gaming experiences, both in the realm of StreetPass games, but also things that are slightly more off-kilter, like the Smash 3DS integration, or maybe even more ambitious dedicated games that could be made if StreetPass fully catches on this next time around. Contrary to gamer belief, the Wii is amongst the most important platforms of all time, and its proliferation of motion gaming is something I could definitely see be pushed even further this coming generation. There's surely more defined applications of the technology that have cropped up, whether it be by way of new innovations or by technology that may have been too expensive for Nintendo to want to include for the original Nintendo Switch. Pushing motion controls on Nintendo's next console could also be a no-brainer if they do end up having some level of VR support, since much like was the case for Labo VR, the console will likely come with Joy-Con that will facilitate VR-ready motion controls. And that lowers the cost of entry when compared to buying something like PSVR 2 that requires purchasing a whole console, a headset, along with the motion controllers. I truly believe that regardless of if by way of VR or not, Nintendo is capable of making more Splatoon-like moments for motion that further legitimize its use in gaming outside of the casual fun they're known for. And again, if Nintendo does choose to pursue VR, I believe this would contribute to them being responsible for VR's first true Mario 64 moment. The first major game that sells the masses on the tech and will be the catalyst for more developers following suit. As it was the basis of this video that Nintendo Switch was very much so a product of iterating on many other concepts Nintendo experimented with in their long history of console production, it's hard to believe that Nintendo Switch itself could directly contribute its own lessons to the next generation. Namely, Nintendo Switch established the Nintendo account system that will largely facilitate its successor's backward compatibility, something Nintendo has been notoriously hesitant to embrace in the modern gaming era. And I don't even think the biggest win for having established Nintendo accounts is backward compatibility in a vacuum. It's also the fact that each user is able to establish and deepen a digital footprint that can lead to better gaming experiences within franchises that use the accounts. It allows for services like Nintendo Music, and if they so choose, it could be a treasure trove for all of the gamers who obsess over reminiscing and more. Honestly, this is much like the last feature in the sense that its importance seems pretty straightforward to me, but I could easily see Nintendo taking it even further than I currently expect them to. Nintendo DS was Nintendo's first console that I contend can be directly traced back to from Switch. It was their first modern handheld, and with that came a bunch of stuff that could have went here, but the feature that interests me the most that I would like to see more of is download play. This feature in particular I think is the least explored of everything I talked about here, and I'm sure that's largely due to Nintendo believing it disincentivizes individual purchases of their games. But I do think there's a middle ground they could occupy with their next generation console that could help them achieve their goal of growing their fan loyalty and online business. They could simply limit the feature to Switch Online subscribers. Hell, they could even limit it to family plan members on top of the limitations that already existed in download play, generally being tied to select games and modes. This way, it's not necessarily incentive against paying to play a game, but rather in most cases, I'd argue it's even better incentive to pay for a service many are hesitant to support for not feeling valuable enough, on top of incentivizing you to buy a game that you just get a little taste of. I'd love to see, say, Splatoon 4 support download play for Splatfest or similar major events to give people a glimpse of the game's value at its best. Or maybe they expand on game trials by giving Switch Online members download play vouchers, as it were, to allow friends to check out games they own and want to convince those friends to buy. I think this would be an easy way for Nintendo to increase their presence in the online space, strengthen the stickiness of their ecosystem, and it could be a pretty good way to expand their franchises even more organically, because I don't know about you, but people have been the best way to get me into new games. And the only real barrier for a lot of those games being that I need to pay full price for a game that I'm not sure of, which, let me be clear, I do understand there's counter arguments to this for the developer, but I can anecdotally say there's been a lot of games that felt essential in my roster after playing them with friends. I still have Fortnite installed on multiple platforms, and Marvel Rivals is something that I'm checking out solely because it's fun to play with friends. That could be true for a lot of Nintendo franchises as well, both new and old. By far the best feature Nintendo has ever implemented in past generations is the upgradable hardware that was present on SNES's cartridges and expanded further on N64 between the expansion packs and 64DD. I think this generation has been yet another shining example that Nintendo isn't a fan of releasing new consoles just for the arbitrary purpose of having a new generation to shill. They very clearly only aim to make new consoles when their in-house developers start to feel like they need more advanced technology to make their ideas come to life. But this idea didn't start with this generation. It started with SNES, which was able to sustain its dominance throughout the 16 and 32-bit era by way of advancements like the Super FX chip, something that every person with an SNES saw the benefits of without needing to buy a mid-cycle refresh or anything like that. Then Nintendo followed this up with the application that I think is more realistic for today. Although I'm not afraid to say I could be wrong about that. I have no idea if building similar upgrades into modern day cartridges is possible. But I digress. N64 had an approach that was somewhere in between Super FX and a full-on Pro console release in the form of 64DD. If it were up to me, the next generation console would go the full 10 years Nintendo talked about for this one before we even need to consider another console launch as a result of hardware expansion, barring some crazy advancement in technology that couldn't be accounted for this way, because as it stands, new generations have been largely useless when it comes to actually playing and benefiting from games. Their only real purpose is the corporate need to have the number go up more and the consumerist need to buy a new thing solely because it's shiny new thing and not because it actually serves their daily lives more than a given generation that exists already can. Thank you to Redirect's first ever executive producer, Trev L. Steinberg, and all of these other great names you see scrolling on the screen for keeping this channel afloat. Remember to go over to shop.watchredirect.com to join them in the credits and in receiving whatever other perks interest you most. Most importantly, if you watched this video this far, you must be excited for Nintendo's next generation console. I'll be talking about that as much as I naturally can. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for future videos about this topic. Okay, that's it for me. See you in the next video.